Great Longstone, tranquil and timeless. Well, certainly parts of the village haven't changed much since these photographs were taken in the 1920s and 30s, when Mabel, Cyril and Frank Hurst, now all sadly no longer with us, were children growing up in this rural working community. Back in the 1980s, their younger sister Sheila, who was a child of the 30s herself, sat down in the family house with her 3 older siblings to take a walk down their collective memory lanes to Longstone between the wars.
Starting from the bottom here, again.
From the Myers. After the First World War, Thornhills had the orchard and a few hens in there. They were selling eggs.
And in 1929 they became the first egg packing station in Derbyshire to produce National Mark eggs, which was a scheme that preceded the little lion stamp as a guarantee of quality. After the Second World War, Thornhills diversified to produce table poultry, and they opened what everyone called the chicken factory on the site that has become Longstone Business Park. So, continuing our journey up the village, what came next?
The first shop was the blacksmith.
It was the blacksmiths.
Peter Burgess's. That's it.
And we used to love going in first and watch them blowing up the bellows for the forge and the anvil and the horses and the smells. And
Now, I filmed Sheila and Frank in 2008, some 20 years after their original sound recording, and I asked them to repeat their journey up the village street and point out just where those shops and other places that they remembered from their childhood had been.
the next place we come to is George Furnace at the Croft, which was their summer home, because he was MP for Williston in London.
His father, George Furnace Sr., had moved from Longstone to London in the 1840s, where his work on railways and sewers and other Victorian infrastructure made him very wealthy. He became a much respected benefactor in Willesden, where he lived, and here in Longstone, where he owned the Croft, which he used as a summer residence. His son, also called George, entered Parliament in the 1920s. Sheila's father had always been good with horses, and that common interest led to a friendship between him and George Furnace the MP, who kept the Croft as his holiday home until his death in 1935. Opposite the Croft was Ernie Holmes' garage, which has now been turned into a cottage. His taxi firm continued what had been several generations of family tradition of carriage hire. Next there's Hanging Gate Cottage, which was said to have once been an alehouse, and it certainly appears to have been at the junction of several ancient routes into the village. But that would have been long before the period that we're talking about. And so we can move up the village to the area around Springbank and Cases, and an 18th century farmhouse called
Barley's.
George Ward, his name was, the old man.
George, Farmer George.
Farmer George Ward and his son Francis and Charlie worked there.
A general farm, just cattle than any arable crop.
It wasn't till the war that they sort of started growing food.
Every farm had to produce as much food as possible for the war effort, so a lot of the local pasture got ploughed up. Next door to Barley's farm was another farmhouse.
Home farm, which was Skidmore's.
All the land to that was a Myers Lane up that end.
That was Archie Skidmore mainly, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, Albert was his father,
Yeah.
and Archie ran the farm.
One little snippet, during the war, you were only allowed 4 minutes to get home if the Bakewell sirens went, and they assumed that I couldn't get from Longstone School down to the Myers in 4 minutes. So I was farmed out, if you like, for the duration of the raid, and the Skidmores very kindly took me in. And as far as I remember, I think there was only 2 or 3 occasions when it went, and then you'd hear the all clear go, and if it was towards the end of the day, of course you didn't bother going back to school, did you?
We now need to go back to the 20s, which was the decade before Casey's shop was built. On that site used to be a barn that was used as a workshop by Herbert Rees. Now he was the village lamplighter, plumber and odd job man. And he lived in Standhill Cottage with his wife and 2 daughters. In the 1930s, the Reeses sold sweets from this hut at the back of their cottage. And before that, from a wooden hut with a plate glass window that stood on the slope somewhere between Main Street and Spring Bank. Now, Mabel clearly remembers coming into this shop when she was a child in the 1920s.
You went up 3 wooden steps into it. It was like one big hut with a big plate glass window, and they had glass shelves with all the sweets and chocolates, and Mrs. Ward at Barley Lees could look at you if you went in the shop.
Presumably, even back then, there was a hedge or wall in front of Barley Lees farmhouse, but from up here in this elevated position where the shop was, you could see over the top of it and wave at Mrs. Ward. Mabel's younger brother Cyril, who was born in 1919, couldn't remember this wooden hut, so it couldn't have lasted very long. But anyway, everything changed when the shop was built in 1932. We think that WN are the initials of William Needham, who was landlord of the Bull's Head in Tideswell. But he also owned property in Longstone because Bill Oliver remembers seeing him coming here to collect rent. That ties in with the fact that the Hursts remember that the first shopkeeper was indeed called Mrs. Needham, who was briefly followed by the Woods, William, who was an army officer, and Doris, who kept the shop. According to the electoral register, the Websters took over in 1934 and ran the shop until 1961, when Neville and Iris Casey took over. The shop closed as a shop in 2014, but it's still used by Nick as a base for his newspaper deliveries. Now, I have to admit that in order to flesh out some of the memories of the Hurst family, I have been speaking to some of the other long-term residents of the village, including Ian Cox. Now, Ian's got a wonderful collection of picture postcards and photographs of the village in days gone by, including this wonderful one of William Webster, stood outside the shop in the 1950s. As you can see, the name board announces that it's a drapers and outfitters, as well as selling sweets and tobacco, and operating a lending library. Okay, so this picture is of the shop after the war, but in truth I don't suppose it had changed very much from when the Websters first took over in the 30s. Now, while I'm here, I'll mention another grocer's shop, although as far as I know it closed sometime during the First World War, and it was in this cottage next to the Hermitage. Now, the earliest record that I found of it comes from the 1881 census, when it was run by Sarah Furness. Her relation Marcella Bottom took over and was running it in 1891, and then her niece Ellen Furness took over. Now, Ellen Furness gets a mention in Robert Thornhill's Longstone Notes, where he remembers her as a kindly woman whose shop sold sweets. Well, he was only a little boy then. And it looks like the Reeses opened their sweet shop just along the bank here, round about 1920, which was roughly when Ellen Furness's shop finally closed. Now, Sheila Hurst's memories of visiting this area only go back to the 1930s. And they weren't for coming to buy sweets.
Before the war and during the war, the doctors used to come into the village, and Dr. Watson used to come to the Hermitage, and you went round the back into the kitchen. That was the waiting room, and you sat there till you were called, and then you came forward to the front room, was the one on the left.
This one, yeah.
And you saw the doctor, and then you came out of the front door, and off you went. And my mother was ill, and I can remember coming up, and at the end of the month you had a bill.
The building that is now the village shop has had several different incarnations. Sally and Keith Brown opened for business in 2014. Before that, the shop had been Sam O'Reilly's Deli and Richard Hobday's Butchers, which continued the trade that had been associated with the Mellors, father and son, for 69 years, until Fred Jr. retired in 2009. Before the Mellors, it was Homewoods. And between the wars, Frank Dawson was the village butcher. But Cyril and Mabel remember another name from that time.
Wardle.
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 Tommy Wardle.
Tommy Wardle, and he went to Darley-Dale from there.
We don't want to know where he went.
Yeah.
He was the butcher.
This picture shows Joshua Worrell Oliver and his wife and daughter outside the newly opened shop back in 1906.
And Mrs. Oliver lived in this one here, and she actually sold coal from there.
Yeah, she did. She
Yeah.
did, yeah.
And Arthur's aunt, who married Charlie Ward, lived in that cottage and up the steps, and she taught music, and I learnt to play the piano with Mrs. Ward, and it was £1 a time, and you came along and there was no electricity, but on each side of the piano there were candlesticks. So when you went, first thing to do was to light the candles, and then you'd start the lesson, and you'd be interrupted by someone knocking at the door because they'd got a jug in their hand and they'd come for a pint of milk or a quart of milk, which was brought up from the farm and kept in a big churn. The next shop, Hancock's.
Hancock's,
Other side road
where Myson's
is now.
And that was
a grocery.
oh, it was general purpose
General,
shop.
everything.
Everything they sold
Everything
there.
in there. Paraffin, lot.
Yeah.
Paraffin tasted butter.
Yes, quite right, Frank.
Yeah.
What did you say?
Paraffin tasted butter.
Paraffin tasted butter.
And cheese.
Cheese.
Yeah.
And then it became the co-op, didn't it? And my mother's co-op number is 233.
Hancock's had sold the shop to the Bakewell and District Cooperative Society in October 1957, and according to their minutes it cost £1,700, and they appointed J.W. Vickers as the branch manager. I'm told that the Bakewell and District Cooperative Society was taken over by the Sheffield and Ecclesall Society in the early 1970s. And it was about at that time that the branch here in Longstone finally ceased trading. Although Ian Cox has reminded me that it became an antique shop and boutique run by Mr. Dodson and his daughter Helen. They were followed by Myson's poultry business, David Burns' print shop, financial advisors, and of course the Milburns antiques and photography businesses. Now what you may not know, and I certainly didn't, was that this was the second time the co-op had had a store here in Great Longstone. Once again, according to their minutes, they were set up in 1901, and shortly after they opened a branch here in Great Longstone. Now, this postcard from Ian Cox's collection shows the village in or before 1913, because there aren't any telegraph poles, and you can just about read the brand name on the adverts outside the shop. The word is Pelor, and that was a co-op owned brand, so this must have been their original shop. It closed down in November 1914, and sometime later, but certainly before 1922, it became Hancock's. So, we're talking about the same shop, twice being a co-op branch here in Longstone.
The next shop, opposite was run by a Mrs. Fern. That was actually the shop. It was only very small, and it was a haberdashery. She sold cottons and laces and silks and all sorts of things. But as I say, it was very, very small. And opposite, at that time, it was Angels.
Yeah, previous it was Robinson's.
Robinson's, yes, and then Angels.
That's right. Baytree House used to be Longstone's busiest shop. It was Robinson's in the 1920s, then Angels in the 30s, which was when this photo was taken. Harold Mansfield, who was a church organist, had it during and after the war. Next it was Johnson and Dowding's, who added a small cafe, which Paul remembers as being very popular. Then it was Milner's, and this picture, which comes from one of Noel Yates's films, shows the shop in 1967, with a carnival float from Ashford pulled up outside. The Milner's name is just about visible over the door. They were followed by the Rices in 1972. In the early 80s it became the Baytree Tea Room, and it finally closed around 1987. But it's the shop's earliest incarnation that's probably the most significant, because this is where Longstone's very first post office was. In the 1850s, when the penny post opened up the Royal Mail to the masses, the main post office in Bakewell took on extra hands in the surrounding villages, and John Lowe, a builder who lived here, became the local agent for Longstone. When Lowe died, his widow Sarah took over and became the village's very first postmistress. 20 years later she moved here to what is now called the old post office, and she continued doing the job until 1907, when she died at the age of 83. Now her daughter Edith, who's also buried with her here in Longstone churchyard, had continued running the shop for a couple of years, but not as a post office, because that side of the business had moved down the road to Annie Green's grocery store, which is now Haven Cottage.
And you went through the door, and facing you, there was the telephone exchange.
That was the first Longstone
That
telephone.
was the first telephone exchange. There was about 3 phones in the village at that time.
Longstone had first got the telephone in 1913, when Annie Green was a postmistress, assisted by her son James. But Frankhurst was born in 1926, so his earliest memories of this post office would have dated from about 1930, which is when Peter Rowland took over as the postmaster. In the 30s, the phone book lists around 40 subscribers with Great Longstone phone numbers, from Cecil Armitage of the Grange to Grace Wright of Guild Low, including Peter Rowland, the postmaster, and the Longstone and District Nursing Association. And of course their phones only worked during post office opening hours, when there was somebody to work the exchange and put them through. I've only found the name of one of the women who did this job in Longstone, and she was 18-year-old Beatrice Turner, who was listed in the government's Wartime Register of Civilians in 1939. Shortly before that, Clement Pashley and his wife Edith went into partnership with Rowland, and the post office and general store expanded into 2 businesses. Haven Cottage remained as Rowland and Pashley's grocers, but the post office, with Peter Rowland as postmaster, moved next door. Derek Wilson took this cine film in 1958. It shows a visiting Morris side outside the 2 shops. Pashley still ran the one on the left, but the post office had changed hands several times. After Peter Rowland, there were the Glasbys and the Bakers, Alice, Rose and Alice. The electoral register bears out Ian Cox's recollection that the older Alice died in 1955 and her daughter Rose married Reginald Forster the following year. So, in this film taken in 1958, you can just about make out Forster's name over the door. But you can see it more clearly in June 1958's Parish Magazine. These adverts are more treasures from Ian Cox's collection, and all these pieces of evidence come together to give us a jigsaw picture of Longstone's not too distant past. Pashleys ceased trading in the early 60s, but the post office remained in business until 2003, when Duncan Finney finally shut up shop. And these pictures from the 1990s are from Fiona Adams' film about life in the village. On the other side of the road, this upstairs room was used by another visiting doctor back in those pre-NHS days. This was the consulting room for Dr. Evans, who's pictured here at the 1960 Vicarage Garden Party.
Don't forget the cobbler's shop up the steps of the barn. Opposite the
Sam Furnace.
Yeah, I remember.
And I'm told that he also had a workshop near the Shackley. And also up the drive, what latterly became Mike Hurst's garage had, between the wars, been Harry Shaw's. By the 50s and 60s, it was McEwen and Bell's. Now, when I filmed Frank and Sheila, but unfortunately when the sound wasn't recording, Frank mentioned the Barn Cafe, which you can just about make out in this old postcard. Frank remembered that this coffee bar had opened when Longstone got an influx of students from Thornbridge Hall, which became a teacher training college in 1945. In this second picture, the cafe has a different sign, and there's an afternoon bus approaching on its way to Tideswell. The cafe was run by Eric and Daphne Glover, and Ian Cox remembers that they also sold fish and chips. Between the wars, however, Longstone's Chippy was on the corner of Station Road, next to Mrs. Wager's home bakery. That's Mrs. Wager's, is
Yes.
it? And
Yeah.
then the one that was Mrs. Lowe's before, and
Yeah, that's right. And Mrs. Wager continued on as a home-baked bread and a cake shop.
And sweets and flour and them sort of things.
in the 50s, some of her cakes came by train from Lyons bakeries, and Chris Gundry used to bring them up from the station on his delivery bike. The Hursts remember this as Mrs. Wager's corner shop from the 20s and 30s, but, as we've seen, it had been the post office run by Sarah Lowe until 1907. She also sold bread and cakes, and her daughter Edith Perry continued to sell these until, presumably, she passed the baton on to Mrs. Wager.
On the same side of the road, there was Burkhead's fish and chip shop.
That building there was where the fish and chip shop was.
And he used to sell
Yeah.
mushy peas.
Then they started selling homemade ice cream.
They sold ice cream from here.
Because if you look at the steps with a child's eye, I thought it was an advert for the wafers. You know, because they donkey stone the middle bit. So that was a big advert to me, that it was an ice cream wafer.
Yeah. Edward Burkhead sold fish, chips, mushy peas and homemade ice cream in the 20s and 30s. So this picture of his ice cream shop, apparently before it was an ice cream shop, was probably taken just before or during the First World War, because there's a gas lamp mounted on a bracket on the corner of Station Road. In this earlier picture there's no streetlight, but the shop looks more like a shop, and the 1891 and 1901 census imply that it would have been George Hambleton's shoe shop. Cars can help to date an image, but in this picture it was the milk churns outside Mrs. Fern's shop that did the trick, because Ian Cox remembered seeing them every day on his way to school back in the 50s. They say that the past is a looking-glass world that's both familiar and different, and I'm grateful to everyone who's helped me to flesh out the Hurst family memories, especially Ian Cox with his treasure trove of picture postcards, Michael Stewart's edition of Robert Thornhill's Longstone Notes, and Keith Taylor's book Aspects of Dale's Life Through Peace and War. But everybody's memories fade with time, and over the last 70 years there's been plenty to remember and forget. So if you've spotted any errors and omissions, please let me know so that I can plug the gaps. But most importantly, it's thanks to Sheila Hurst, who back in the 80s made those original cassette recordings of her family's memories of Longstone
between the wars.